as Fikret was talking, we were both at the, you know, the conference in Taiwan just before the COVID hit. And actually, that was my last international travel before I retired. And so I am now retired from the University of Mexico. I'm still doing a lot of work with a lot of the local indigenous, groups and projects. Not so much with the University of New Mexico, but actually with other universities and other projects and programs, primarily in the area of indigenous education and also in this area of native science. So, I guess in terms of just general background, I'm again Greg Cajete from uh, the uh, the state of New Mexico in the United States. I'm a Tewa indigenous person, and I have been a teacher and a researcher for 46 years at least, in terms of my actual teaching career. I've written several books on indigenous education and native science, and I'm also now working in a variety of different projects related to native concerns, native health, native education. And so it's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to, share these thoughts and perspectives with the Sami indigenous peoples, and also within the context of your conference. Um, and again, I think that as indigenous people, we do hold, while we're very diverse, and we live in different parts of the world, that we do share an understanding, a worldview, if you will, of relationship to the land and to each other that has existed for thousands of years. Actually, in many ways, it was the first human way of social learning and understanding and creating of culture that existed throughout the globe at one time. And it's interesting that as indigenous people, we still hold on to, threads of that tradition, threads of that heritage that allow us now to, continue our ways of knowing, our ways of being in the places in which we live, in some very unique and now I think very timely in terms of the kinds of knowledge and understandings we hold, as Fikret has just presented, in terms of our ability to contribute to, addressing the challenges of climate change as it begins to unfold worldwide. So my presentation is broad in the sense that I want, and I've really been involved with trying to describe, to non-indigenous public as well as indigenous peoples, what I mean by native science. So my presentation is going to be primarily about that. And so with your permission, I'll go ahead and move forward with that. Again, I just retired from the University of New Mexico, and this presentation is, predicated on that. So I'm hoping that I can advance. There we go. So, kind of the background to what Frederick has just, stated in his presentation. Native science is essentially integrates a spiritual orientation in the way that it understands and views the knowledge based on observations of the natural world. It's very dynamic. Its focus is on really perpetually participating in that harmony of the universe as a whole. It believes that all human knowledge is related to the creation of the world, and the emergence of human knowledge is based on human cosmologies. And so, as you know, the Sami, as well as other indigenous people, have an understanding of how humans, came into the world based on our origin stories and all of the different kinds of stories that are part of that whole complex. Um, and there's the basic belief that humanity has an important role in the perpetuation of the natural processes of the world, but you have to understand that, and know that, and really begin to practice how to apply that understanding in the places in which you live. The idea that everything is animate and has spirit, and there's significance to each natural place because each place reflects the whole of a natural order, very much like a hologram, in the sense that it's a reflection. Every place is a reflection of every other place. And there's a history of relationship that must be respected with regard to places, plants, animals, and natural phenomena. So these are some of the general precepts and perspectives that indigenous people around the world, have in regard to what I call the basis or foundation of native science. So native science philosophy continued is one of its precepts is that technology should be appropriate and reflect balanced relationship to the natural world. There are basic relationships and patterns and cycles in the world that need to be understood. And this is the role of indigenous mathematics, or indigenous gathering of data, if you would, if you would put it in those terms. There are stages to the initiation of this knowledge. Elders are relied upon as the keepers of this essential knowledge. And I might add that during the COVID, many indigenous communities lost many elders. So some of this knowledge, has to be revitalized in a variety of different kinds of ways. Um, Acting in the world must be sanctioned through ritual and ceremony. So there's intention to what you're going to do in relationship or in action in an environment. And the ritual and ceremony is a way to understand the seriousness or the importance of something that you are about to do. It's properly fashioned artifacts, which include the technologies and the artifacts that indigenous people create. Uh, it is thought that all of these things contain the energy of the thought and the materials and the context in which they are fashioned, and therefore become symbols of those thoughts, those entities, and those processes. And I should say that, while I'm talking about artifacts here, that forms of thought, understandings, perspectives are also creations that this principle can be applied to. And then also, the understanding in many indigenous cultures that dreams are considered important sources of knowledge, and can be used creatively, and can lead to creative possibilities if used wisely and practically. And so, these are just general precepts that I think indigenous people share, as you begin to see and hear those philosophies around the world, you begin to see that they have these understandings in common. Although there's, of course, diversity and variations in the ways in which they are expressed. Um, so, science itself, the word for science is actually a translation from a Greek word for knowledge. And in this perspective, science is used in the term that's most inclusive of its meanings, as a story of the world and a practiced way of living in it, as a story of the world and a practiced way of living in it. And so, given that definition, all indigenous cultures have a science. All indigenous cultures have a science. So, native science is used as a metaphor for native knowledge. It's creative participation with the natural world in both theory and practice. This essay, or this presentation, celebrates and acknowledges that native contributions to an evolving and inclusive world philosophy of science, as well as ecological awareness. So, Native people, I think because of this understanding, this perspective, this history, this heritage, need to have a place in the World Forum with regard to particularly issues that affect the world as a whole, which is, of course, at this time, climate change. And of course, there are others as well. Um, I'm not really talking about religion because religion is more of a Western concept, but it does reflect aspects of how religion evolves. What I'm talking about here is essentially an environmental philosophy, a cultural environmental philosophy. And the essence of Native spirituality is not a religion in Western sense of the term, but rather a set of core beliefs in the sanctity of personal community relationships to the natural world, which are creatively acted upon and expressed at both personal and communal levels. So this is kind of a baseline, you know, statement, that I generally make with regard to, what exactly is uh, Native science? What is it all about, so to speak? It's also about a different creative journey because in many ways, indigenous science is coming and is predicated and founded on an indigenous worldview. Um, it's a product of a different kind of creative journey and a different history than that of Western science. It's not quantum physics or environmental science, but it has come to similar understandings about the workings of natural laws through experience and participation with the natural world in places. So the Sami knowledge of reindeer and reindeer herding and the context in which that is done and that livelihood is done is really an example, like many examples of indigenous knowledge all over the world. So at this point, I have to say that it's in some ways it's a misnomer to say that there is just native science, because actually there are native sciences, and there are as many native sciences as there are indigenous peoples in the world. So each indigenous group has its own unique flavor, if you will, its own unique expression of this knowledge, this science. And so that I think is very obvious, but I think I need to state that. But it's a different journey, a different kind of exploration, a different way of being in the world. And at one time, the indigenous way was the human way. It was expressed and shared by all human populations on the planet. So we have to think of native science in those terms as well. Um, what's really important in terms of native science is that everyone who is alive, who is a part of a community, who is part of a family, who lives in a place, is a participant in this process, in this knowledge gaining, knowledge understanding, knowledge sharing. So it reflects the unfolding story of a creative universe in which human beings are an active and creative participant. When viewed from this perspective, science is evolutionary. Its expression unfolds through a general scheme of creative process of first insight, immersion, creation, and reflection. So I have to say that native science is a creative uh, process. It is in itself a creation. It evolves through time and through generation and through as native people interact with their environments, their knowledge, their understandings change based on prior insights. Um, as Friedrich said before, and that dynamic nature of native science needs to be kept in mind. That it is a ever evolving kind of knowledge system based on the experiences of past, but also current realities. So it's a very reality-based kind of way of thinking about one's participation in the natural world or with the natural world. It's a reflection of the metaphoric mind embedded in the creative participation with nature. It reflects both intellectual and essential capacities of humans, so it's holistic. And it's tied to spirit and is both ecological and integrative. So we are active participants, in this knowledge building, this knowledge sharing, and that's why it makes it a very important foundation for the whole notion of resilience, because in many ways you need that kind of foundation, and understanding to begin to really become creative in terms of your thinking about adaptation, about coping, and even going to the stage of transformation. Uh, so what's native science? Well, to address it, you have to define the boundaries of native science. In reality, it's a broad and inclusive term that can include categories such as metaphysics and philosophy, art and architecture, practical technologies and agriculture, ritual, ceremony practiced by indigenous people, both past and present. Native science encompasses areas such as astronomy, farming, plant domestication, plant medicine, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, metallurgy, geology, and an array of other studies related to plants, animals, and natural phenomena. It extends beyond even these areas to include spirituality, community, creativity, appropriate technologies which sustain environments and support essential aspects of human life. Now, I like to say, because we have a budding new science, called sustainability science, which has been evolving, over these past decades. And I have to say that, in really looking at native science and all the practices, both past and present, that essentially native science is the first sustainability science, in the sense that it has always been about figuring out how to survive in places and environments, um, given one's knowledge and understanding, and the application of prior knowledge, of being creative in terms of figuring out how to live and how to survive and how to sustain oneself through generations and through time in a place. And so it's both a sustainable science orientation and also an ecological science orientation, along with many of the other kinds of things that one could be said about this. So it's very holistic. Um, Native science includes exploration of basic questions such as the nature of language, thought, and perception, the movement of time and space, the nature of human knowing and feeling, proper relationship to the cosmos, and other such questions related to natural reality. So in many ways, it is also a natural philosophy. It's a collective heritage of human experience with the natural world. And in its most essential form, it's a map of natural reality drawn from the experiences of thousands of human generations, which give rise to the diversity of human technologies and even to the advent of modern mechanistic science itself. In very profound ways, native science can be said to be inclusive of modern science. Although properly conditioned, Western scientists will go to great lengths to deny this inclusivity. So, when you begin to look at and really unpack what native science is, what role it has played in human histories, through time and through generation, one begins to see that it was and continues to be one of the most profound forms of human knowledge systems that exist and continue to exist. So why is it important? Why is native science and philosophy important today? Um, in most native languages that I'm aware of, there's not a word for art or for philosophy or for psychology or for science. Um, there are ways of talking about those or describing those forms of knowledge, but not necessarily terms that are very specific like we have in English, for those disciplines, if you will, today. But uh, one could say that it's a process of coming to know and to understand the nature of life and our relationships as human beings in that life. But not having this word is actually not needing a word for science did not diminish either its practice or its importance in native life. For native people, seeking life was encompassing task. It was the encompassing task of their life and every member of the tribe. So this is why, this life instinct, which we do have words for, and which we do have a variety of ways of expressing our understanding of that process of continually seeking life, one's individual life, the life of one's family and community and tribe, and also including in that the life of the environment in which we live, and that gives us life. And so all of those concepts, were very much an integral part of the evolution, if you will, of native science through time and through generation. So for native people, seeking life was that metaphor, that contained a lot of this understanding. Um, and in their own time and through their own unique capacity, um, native people were scientists and artists and storytellers, and they participated in the great web of life around them. While there were tribal specialists with particular knowledge, technologies, ritual understanding for specific practices and social needs, the creative spirit and focus on essential life sustaining relationships guided the processes of most native science practices in the past, and certainly it's also operating in today's indigenous world. So so for us as native people, this is our foundational form of knowledge, that we are attempting to revitalize, to relearn, to find ways to re-express in the contemporary setting. And certainly it's needed, I think, in terms of addressing many of the many challenges of climate change that we are now faced with. So it's a way of thinking, coming to know. Um, it's born of a lived and storied participation in the environment. Uh, it's based on all of those kinds of things that I've just said. I think I've really said this already, but in biology we call this the instinct of biophilia, which was a term coined, by E.O. Wilson, in describing this deeply embedded instinct that we as humans have, which is based on, seeking life, perpetuating life, human life, and then extending it now also as a philosophy to the extension of caring for and stewarding all life on the planet. So, so there are a lot of ways to understand native science, and certainly my work, as an educator, has been to really try to describe, try to teach about what the philosophy of native science is, both to indigenous peoples, because in some cases we're in situations where we're relearning a lot of our own traditions, cultures, languages, ways of knowing, and at the same time, simultaneously, to remind non-indigenous peoples that this is a part of the human tradition of knowledge and needs to be explored, particularly in this time and place. So in earlier times, this and what I call native science was viewed as animism or worship of nature. Uh, and there are numerous other definitions, but in its core, native science is based on the natural perceptive wisdom and knowledge gained through using the whole body of our senses on a direct participation with the natural world. So this is the reason why we dance. This is the reason why we sing. This is the reason why we have ceremony and ritual, because all of these are forms or contexts in which we are participating with our human beingness, with those entities that we're celebrating, that we're connected to, that we're relating to. So in today's world, the appreciation of the nature of native science is essential, I think, in many ways, because what it's pointing to is that science has to recapture a participatory sense of life, and it's desperately needed, I think, at this time, to balance the imbalance of science and technology and its continuing social and economic crisis and consequences. And so it's really an important understanding and perspective that needs to come back into the practice of modern Western science to balance it in a way that would allows it to be much more broad in terms of its impact, and much more broad in terms of its understanding and its place in the human knowledge system. And for Native peoples, of course, the revitalization of Native science is essential to our cultural revitalization and preservation. Um, it's the participation of tribal with the tribal communal landscape, which evolved directly from relationship of a place or places in their history, past and present, which defines them as people. So it goes back to that Aboriginal Australian saying, healthy country, healthy people. That idea, many ways in which that has been expressed, by Indigenous peoples themselves. So, the dilemma that we have today, I think, is that we, for the most part, as modern people, participants in the modern society and the modern economy and modern forms of education, that we have become, increasingly estranged from the natural world. And it's in the few islands of Indigenous peoples and communities around the world where we can still see, that possibility of, reconnection to the natural world in a way that allows us to sustain and to be resilient in the face of challenges and changes that we're dealing with today in terms of climate change and other kinds of issues that has brought forward. Um, we understand that modern technology cuts us off from, rather than connects us to the processes of the natural world, to the extent that many people grow to fear and distance themselves from the natural, which in E.O. Wilson's terms is called biophobia, a fear of nature, a fear of things living, a fear of interaction with the natural world. And so modern people grow up detached from the very ground of their biological being, and become so accustomed to technologically mediated interpretation of the world that they come to think that the real world is the very technology which mediates their experience. Think of our cell phones, think of our modern, media systems, think of our television, think of all the things that are technologically mediated in our society today. Get cut off from this direct experience and participation with the natural world, we collectively suffer a kind of sensory and emotional starvation, which at times reaches epidemic proportions and leads many of us to various forms of acting out of mind at the individual and collective level. And that term "out of mind," you know, characterizes almost every facet of modern life today, in so many different kinds of ways. Um, so we're living at a time where we really have to consider, what is going to help us sustain ourselves, into the future. And certainly native science is one of those possibilities, if you will. Heinrich Sklimowoski, who is a Polish eco-philosopher, says this: the modern mind has lost its sense, its bearings, its orientation to its roots and the natural processes of which it is a part. To address this perpetual blindness, a new science must be developed that includes in its very core the reintroduction of the participatory mind. It must once again become a mind that is cyclically renews its orientation to the primal world of life and living process. It must be a mind which recalls and reestablishes the basis of human awareness in the larger ecology of the world. Science as a whole must once again become the story of this awareness and relationship to the animate world. And language must once again be understood as the body-based vehicle which refers to the animate landscape, which gave rise to its expression. The thought which guides our actions and comprises our contemplation must be understood as a part of the dynamic expression of the physical as well as metaphorical air which animates all of nature. So it's a thought that is out there, right? And certainly, you know, these kinds of understandings and perspectives are being discussed extensively, in every aspect of academia to these days. Uh, at one time, they were in the margins. They're moving now closer to the center of the debate and discussion. So, here, as I say, the sense of being immersed in a sentiment world is preserved in the oral stories and songs of the indigenous peoples, in the belief that all sensible phenomena are all alive and aware, in the assumption that all things have the capacity of speech. Language for all peoples is not a human invention, but a gift from the land itself. So it's the ecologically aware and participatory mind that modern science must begin to once again explore and encompass. For it's that mind, a way of thinking, understanding, and participating that holds the best and most life-sustaining solutions to the current disconnection of science from the ground of its own being. So that idea, and it's a very one would say that certainly in terms of science itself, it's a very controversial perspective, to espouse that science has to get back to its roots. But I think, reality and some of the issues that we're facing and challenging today, are leading to that conclusion as well. So other Western scientists, sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, advocates that everything that we consider human is reducible to our essential biological nature, which is in turn predicated upon the laws of physics of nature. Ken Wilber, who's an evolutionary philosopher, believes that there can be no return to pre-modern modes of life in the evolutionary flow of consciousness, although prior forms of consciousness continue to exist in human society today. And so what he's saying is that, well, we've already evolved, into modern humans, as we would call ourselves, I guess, today. And that we're no longer those humans that where these understandings, these ways of knowing were developed to begin with, but we can learn from that. We can learn from the understandings of our ancestors and bring them forward in new and creative and more productive kinds of ways. So a new balance must be created, is what he is saying in these terms. So I want to just sort of finish with just these last few thoughts, perspectives, because this is getting kind of heady, and and I don't want to lose everyone in what we call philosophical discourse, but really I want to sort of emphasize uh, that a lot of writers uh, are Western writers, are actually writing about this in a variety of different kinds of contexts, different journals. And so the proliferation of these kinds of essays, these kinds of explorations is actually increasing. If you actually, do a survey of kinds of articles that are being produced in all the disciplines, that relate to this. So my conclusion is that native science in its diverse forms of historic as well as contemporary expression presents templates for the kind of reconstruction and evolution of modern science required to address the issues and needs of a 21st century world in the throes of ecological crisis, and for which it shares responsibility for creating. Ecologically responsible science must become the hallmark of 21st century technology if we are to face the monumental environmental social challenges of this next millennia. The new story of science must once again assist us in living a storied relationship and reciprocity with a myriad of things and beings and that perpetually surround us. And this really is talking about, in the form of David Abrams' statement here, that we have to really begin to sort of deeper into our history, into our knowledge systems that have come before us, to begin to mine those systems in ways that allow us to begin to understand ourselves and understand the kinds of issues and challenges and what we need in terms of knowledge systems to address them now and into the future. So I want to sort of leave, you with that kind of tidbit. There's a lot of opportunities and challenges, with regard to native science. And I think, a lot of the perspectives that have been already been shared, really lead to this, the development, for instance, of native science and Western science, this collaboration really can be the foundation of some very creative thinking. And native scientists, though few in number, have the opportunity to become leading advocates for such rethinking and transformation of Western science. And I have to say that a lot of my colleagues who are all involved with this debate, native colleagues around the world, are doing exactly this, in ways that that we can do that, So the basic conflict now, and this has been stated before, is that there are those who would argue that there's no such thing as native science. Science is an invention of modern society, Western society, and that so-called indigenous peoples have a body of cultural folklore, living practices, and thought, which cannot be considered a rational and ordered system of theory and investigation, and comparable to anything found in Western science. And so this is kind of the argument that still continues, in some circles. There's a pushback in the sense that Indigenous people are saying using Western orientations and definitions to measure the credence of non-Western peoples' ways of knowing and being the world has been historically applied to deny their lived reality. Indigenous people are still exist and do not need an external authority to validate their long existence. And attempts to define native science, which is by its nature alive, dynamic, ever evolving through generations, falls short since it is characteristically a high context, inclusive system of knowledge that evolves through time. So, this is kind of the crux of the debate currently, in terms of to include native science, as a serious part of negotiations or policy making or policy design, or even as a foundation for research. And so the debate continues, and I think that as more indigenous people participate in those debates, participate in bringing forward aspects of native science into the work that they're doing with regard to climate change or with regard to adaptive strategies or even transformative strategies, for the future. That eventually there'll be a kind of place that we arrive at where there's a place where there can be true creative collaboration, for the betterment of all. And so I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. I've retired, of course, from active, participation in at least the institutional aspects of that. But nonetheless, I continue with my students, my many graduate students, and my many colleagues around the world to participate in the debate and the discussion. So I thank you for this time. I wish you the best with regard to the SAME conference. And I hope I've given you some food for thought, at least in terms of what is native science and what is its place in the world today, and what can be its place in the future worlds that we are now in the process of creating. So thank you for that. And again, Inger, I'm turn it back to you.